Good morning, everyone, and
Morning.
welcome to our Sunday morning Bible class.
Yeah,
Jacob, I'm happy to be here. You happy to be here?
I am. I'm happy to be here.
As my mother always said, bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, and ready to learn. Put that last part on.
Yeah, I don't know about all that, but I'm here.
We're going to be shifting gears. You know, we've been working through Ecclesiastes. We finished that study up last week. If you missed any of those, they're still out there on the YouTube. So feel free to go back. I thought it was a quality study myself, though I may be partial. But we're shifting gears and we're moving toward another favorite text of mine, and I think of Jacob's as well, and that is the text of James. Jacob, one thing I find about myself in my Bible study and what I tend to gravitate towards, I really like practical application.
Yeah.
Right? And I think about Ecclesiastes and James, there's a lot of practical application. James has always been, I don't know if it's my favorite text in the New Testament, but probably, if not one, number two, because it is so practical. It's practical advice on how we live our lives as a Christian. There's not a lot of fluffy language in James.
Yeah, he's pretty straightforward with it.
I mean, you know, if you don't take care of people in need, your religion is worthless. If you don't bridle your tongue, your faith is worthless. So we're going to spend the next few weeks working through James, and hopefully this will be a study that will benefit us. I know anytime I spend time in this text, I come away with, at the very least, reminders of things that I deal with in my day-to-day life. We're going to read verse 1 and then spend some time introducing our author. James chapter 1, verse 1 says, James, a bondservant of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ, to the 12 tribes which are scattered abroad, greetings.
So one thing that's kind of important to look at is, in any of these texts we're reading, is the purpose behind it, who wrote it, and who they originally wrote it to. Now we know all of this is applicable to us because we're followers of Jesus and that's who it was written to, but to see how James specifically says this is to the 12 tribes who are dispersed. And there's probably a reason for that. The 12 tribes were dispersed really at two different times. At the death of Jesus, the arrest of Jesus, we know a lot of his disciples scattered, but also at the death of Stephen. So at the death of Stephen, once Christians were really starting to be put to death for their faith, that also made people start to scatter. And so if you are familiar with James at all, the brother of Jesus is who we believe this James is, not the apostle, but the brother of Jesus, and we're introduced to him. Yeah,
That's generally accepted.
Yeah,
right. Most scholars and historians you read generally accept that this is James, the brother of Jesus, writing this.
Right. So, and we're introduced to James, we believe, in the gospel accounts, but really we learn a lot about him in Acts chapter 15. So in Acts chapter 15, they call it the Jerusalem Council, and as Paul describes it, it's this time where a lot of the Jews were being unfair to the Gentiles, and Paul needed to address it. And it got to be such a contentious thing that they had to bring it to the Jerusalem Council. The elders of the entire church met in Jerusalem and to discuss this issue of what do we do with these Gentiles who are converting to Christianity. Do they have to convert pretty much to be an Israelite as well? And so they go through that. There's a lot of debate. Famously, Peter and Paul disagree on this because even though Peter was the first one to take the gospel to the Gentiles, he has kind of fallen into the peer pressure of removing himself from them a little bit.
Right, yeah, it's what Paul rebuked him for, right? In Galatians.
Exactly. So you have all of that going on, but we get introduced to James after they've been discussing these things. In verse 13, we're told, after they had stopped speaking, James answered, saying, Brethren, listen to me. And I think just you can stop there and learn a whole lot about James, right? That he could stand up amongst all these leaders. Now, these aren't just normal people. These are leaders of the church. Paul, Peter, apostles are represented here. And James is the one who steps up and says, listen to me. I'm gonna give you my words on this. And what we know is that's what accepted. And he pretty much, we'll read what he says. Simeon has related how God first concerned himself about taking from among the Gentiles a people for his name. With this, the words of the prophets agree, just as written. After these things I will return, and I will rebuild the tabernacle of David, which has fallen, and I will rebuild its ruins, and I will restore it, so that the rest of mankind may seek the Lord, and the Gentiles who are called by my name, says the Lord, who makes these things known from long ago. Therefore it is my judgment that we do not trouble those who are turning to God from among the Gentiles, but that we write to them, and they abstain from things contaminated by idols, and from fornication, and from what is strangled, and from blood. For Moses, from ancient generations, has every city those who preach him, since he has read in the synagogues every Sabbath. Then it seemed good to the apostles and the elders with the whole church to choose men from among them to send to Antioch with Paul and Barnabas, Judas called Barsabbas, and Silas, leading men among the brethren. So you get this thought where James stands up amongst these elders and the apostles, and his voice was the sounding voice on this decision. The biggest decision to this point for Christianity. So as James starts out his letter saying, this is to the 12 tribes who are scattered, we know from Acts 15 just the amount of respect and how much power his words brings to those people. Because in that moment where the leaders of the Christianity, the Jewish Christians are meeting, his voice was above everyone else. Mm-hmm. And I think that's really important, and why probably he's so direct and doesn't fluff anything. His words mean a lot, and it's respected so much that he knows he can be direct, right, and it's going to be received.
Well, and Jacob, I like his approach to his argument there as he begins speaking in verse 13, because he recenters the discussion. He says, look, it's always been the plan that God would extend out to the Gentiles what he has given his children. Right? The grace and possibility of salvation.
Right.
He said, so that being said, and then he makes his decision, here's what we ought to do. But he recenters everyone saying, Peter notes earlier, look, I've been sent to the Gentiles to preach the word.
Right.
And James harkens back to the old law, right?
Mm-hmm.
And says, look, this has always been the plan. Now let's do what's best by these non-Jew, but now our brother Christians.
Which is part of their problem, right? They're hung up still on a lot of the things of the old law of what they should be doing, these new Gentiles should be having to do. So he doesn't just go away from it. He actually uses it to make his point.
So in keeping those things in mind as we work through James over the next few weeks, keeping his audience in mind, as Jacob pointed out, certainly James's text applies directly to us, but keeping the idea in our minds of the lens through which he was writing, his background, the authority and the respect that he has amongst those who were Jewish Christians at the time. And certainly I have to believe that the Gentile Christians got this letter and gobbled it up as well. Right?
Yeah. I mean, we do today, right?
Right, yeah. Right. They pored over it. They made copies of it. They passed it around, which is why we have it today. But we'll keep that in mind as we work through this study. So let's get into the meat of the text here. Verse 2. My brethren, count it all joy when you fall into various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces patience.
Can we just stop there for a second?
Yeah.
What a way to start it out, right? Like, be joyful when hard things come to you. Like, that's his first statement to these people, to his audience. And you got to understand what, we know he is martyred. We know that James is willing to do whatever. So he knows he's probably already experienced hard times and knows that hard times are coming. But Paul oftentimes starts out his letters with, sending pleasantries and letting them know how proud he is of them to establish that. James just, like we said, just comes straight into it and says, hey, bad times are going to come, find joy in that.
Right. Rejoice in it. Yeah. Yeah, he doesn't, again, to the direct writing style of James, there's not a lot of fluff. I guess the antithesis of James would be Paul, right? Not to say Paul's writing is fluff, but
because he just starts out softer, right? And gets to
Paul gets into a lot of imagery and emotion. Of course, with me, it's always the run-on sentence with Paul. The way we have it translated in our Bibles today, you can't piece the sentences together. James is direct and to the point, which is part of what I like about him throughout this text. Verse 4, but let patience have its perfect work, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking nothing. If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives to all liberally and without reproach, and it will be given to him. But let him ask in faith, with no doubting, for he who doubts is like a wave of the sea, driven and tossed by the wind. For let not that man suppose that he will receive anything from the Lord. He is double-minded, unstable in all his ways. And we'll stop right there for a brief bit of a discussion. So, you know, like Jacob pointed out, he leads in with this idea of look, things are going to be tough.
Yeah.
The world's going to hate you. As Jesus said, the world's going to hate you because it hated me first. It doesn't know me. And so James is getting his readers prepared for that. And then it's interesting that he ties it in with the patience it takes to be a Christian.
Yeah.
And the patience it takes to deal with some of the things that are thrown in our face, the things that we have to endure. He says, but let patience have its perfect work. Well, I should tie it back to verse 3. He links the trials to our development of patience, right? What the physical and emotional and spiritual strain that we go through every day, Jacob.
Yeah.
It's every day. And understanding that those trials produce in us that patience, and that patience can make us perfect with nothing that we're lacking. And we'll get into the discussion on wisdom in a minute. As I was reading this, I wanted to tell a brief story. Jacob, I like stories. I'm not a great storyteller, but I like stories.
Okay.
So this summer I had an opportunity to do some hiking in Colorado. Mm-hmm. And I met a guy, just happened upon him. He was in the middle of, he was actually bowing out of, it's an unsanctioned race. So it's generally accepted as a race, but there's not, it's not a race course with people cheering and things. This race is a 100-mile race over 14,000-foot peaks.
That sounds disgusting.
And they've got to do it in 60 hours.
Yeah, that's gross.
So this guy was on peak number 5 when I met him, and he was starting to hurt. He was realizing he was not going to make it, and ended up I had the opportunity to give him a ride back to his car because he had to just bail off the mountain. And the poor guy, I told him when I started out walking with him, I said, man, I ask a lot of questions, so if you get annoyed, just stop me. I asked him so many questions about how do you run for 100 miles? How do you go night after night without sleep? And to hear him talk about the and I'm linking this in, right? So I'm not.
I see it coming.
Yeah. To hear him talk about the endurance and the patience and his approach, because when he's facing a race that covers 100 miles and 14 peaks, he didn't think about peak number 7 at peak number 1.
Right.
He didn't even really think about the top of the first peak. He was thinking about, how do I get up the next 20 feet?
Yeah.
What's the next rock I'm going to put my foot on?
Right.
He kept his head down, and he kept plodding along and plodding along and plodding along. And in all of, he's done a lot of endurance race type stuff over the years. In all of those activities, his mindset was always on, what's the next thing I've got to do to be successful? And the whole time, I'm working on a sermon in my head the whole time he's talking.
Right.
The whole time, I'm thinking, this guy is at the pinnacle of human physical endeavor, right? And he's talking about having patience with something in your approach, looking to the very next step, looking to the very next day, whatever it is for us as Christians, the very next activity, and that ways he could improve. And that was the other takeaway I had was, he was dejected because he was having to drop out of this race.
Yeah.
But before he and I got down the mountain, he was already thinking about ways that he could improve himself for next time. Maybe what in his training had gone wrong, what was wrong with his diet, what had caused his leg to start hurting. He was already thinking about ways he could get better. And so in James' discussion about knowing that these trials produce patience, and looking at that in a very physical sense, it's the same for us where we have a day where we're low. We have a day where we fail. We fail to be a good influence. We let sin creep into our lives. We use harsh language. Steve's talking on Wednesday nights about our language, right? And I would encourage you, if you're not watching those lessons, to watch Steve's lessons on Wednesday nights about our words with friends, right? Yeah. As it's entitled. But we have those days where we fail.
Yeah.
And we can get mired in that failure, and we can feel sorry for ourselves, or we can let that produce in us a patience and a growth, and know that, you know what, the next day is going to be hard, but I'm going to use this as an educational and learning opportunity to stretch myself and to grow as a Christian.
Well, you know, the interesting thing about patience and endurance is they're kind of absolutes. Either you're patient or you're not patient. You know, oftentimes you'll hear somebody say, I'm a pretty patient person. Well, the thing about patience is once patience goes away, you're not patient anymore, right? Like either you're patient and all the time, or you're not patient. Like,
what do we say? I have lost my patience.
Yeah, I've lost it. Well, then
I had it, and now it's gone.
Yeah, because it's not something that you can have just a little bit of, right? It's either you're patient or you're not. And endurance works the same way. And as you're talking about, you know, James says getting to that perfect place, you know, the ability to have those things keeps you at a constant. And I believe perfection here is, he's saying, that constant endurance, that constant patience, because that's what it's going to take. And it's interesting, your guy who says that, he's working on the next few things. So many times we focus on our end goal, which is heaven, which we're supposed to, but we lose patience whenever we don't focus on getting to the next thing here, right? Whenever we just look too far forward, while that's our goal and it's got to be in our sight, we've got to be focusing on what's before us right now to keep that patience.
Yep. And a lot of times and we'll get into this in later weeks, James is focused on doing.
Yeah.
You don't think about what it is to be a Christian, you do what it is to be a Christian. And we think about times in our lives when we identify a deficiency, right? There was a time in my life when my prayer life was not what it ought to be. And so what do? Sometimes it looks too insurmountable, whatever the change that needs to be made. And we put it off, and we wait, and we reason our way around why we shouldn't start doing something. Or we find incremental ways to improve, right? So my incremental change years ago when I thought, I don't pray to God nearly enough, was every time I got in the car, I made it a rule, could not click on the radio until I said a prayer to God, right? It was an incremental change. Mm-hmm. It took some time, but that grew into other facets of my life where praying became more second nature and less rule-based. Just an example of having that patience to say, you know what, I'm not where I need to be in this area. Let's make a change, an incremental change even, and continue to plod forward with that day after day after day, focusing on the next day, the next goal, until we look back and we think, wow, we've come a long way and we've made a lot of growth, when really we're just focused on how do I survive the next day or how do I survive the next week.
Definitely.
So he gets, we stopped there a little bit after 4. He gets into this idea of asking God for wisdom. And of course, there's a lot of parallel between Ecclesiastes and James. And of course, wisdom being one of the key things that Solomon writes about, both in Ecclesiastes and in Proverbs. Mm-hmm. And I want us to think about this idea just for a minute. He says, if you lack wisdom, ask God for wisdom. And ask in faith. And God will give it to you. And I wonder, how often do I really believe that, Jacob?
Yeah, it's a good question.
How often do I pray for wisdom?
Right.
Right? I've made decisions in my life that stressed me and worried me, and I don't know that my first thought was to pray for wisdom, right? My first thought was to use whatever reasoning I had, maybe call a friend who had gone through something like that, but didn't just sit down and ask God for wisdom. And then if I do that, am I in full faith believing that He's going to give it to me?
Well, and we've talked about how this is one of our favorite texts in the New Testament, and part of that is because of this idea. This has shaped the way I look at prayer a lot. Anytime someone asks if they can pray for me about something, typically my answer is always wisdom, because if you have wisdom, usually things can fall into place. And I think that's the point James is making is, once you have the patience and endurance, if you have wisdom as well, everything is going to fall into place. So while the patience and endurance has a lot to do with me, putting those incremental things, making those changes, he says, wisdom can only come from God. Mm-hmm. God is the only one who has wisdom. So thinking about prayer life and what you ask for, that has shaped the way I look at people praying for me so much, is to where now, anytime someone asks me, there may be other things going on, maybe get specific, because I know we're supposed to pray for those things, but wisdom is always at the top of my list of what if I'm going to ask for, just because of how James describes it right here.
Mm-hmm. Let's look down at verse 9. It says, "Let the lowly brother glory in his exaltation, but the rich in his humiliation, because as a flower of the field he will pass away. For no sooner has the sun risen with a burning heat than it withers the grass, its flower fails, and its beautiful appearance perishes. So the rich man will also fade away in his pursuits." Jacob, I just mentioned the link between a lot of what's presented in James and what Solomon writes about.
Right.
And never is that more true than those two verses.
Yeah.
Those three verses, right? Because we spent the last 5 weeks on Ecclesiastes, and so much of it was focused on the vanity of life and how much more blessed. I feel like I didn't say that right. Anyway,
I think you got it.
the blessing of being someone who is poor, like in a physical sense, right? But has wisdom, far more above, as Solomon uses the example, a king who lacks wisdom, right? He several times says that poor man who is wise is so much better off. And the same thing that James is pointing out here, it's humbling yourself in a physical sense so that you can be glorified spiritually.
Well, and the other thing with wisdom and all of that is what we know is knowledge is not wisdom, right? Mm-hmm. Just knowing something, Jesus' famous story that we tell to kids is, the wise man built his house on the rock. What he says in Matthew 7 is, those of you who hears these words of mine and do is the wise man. Those of you who hear these words of mine, have the knowledge, have the information, and do not do is a foolish man. So knowledge is not wisdom. Wisdom comes from actually doing and going and with the knowledge.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And to your point, it brought to mind a quote that I heard recently by a man named Jim Quick. He said, "We're drowning in information and starving for wisdom."
Yeah.
And there's that,
definitely.
Jacob and I like to sit around and talk. If you've been around us much, we tend to argue some. But I can't tell you how many times we've been arguing about a point, and both of us have to go to our phones and say, okay, what was the fact here behind this point that we're trying to make? We have more knowledge at our fingertips than you ever have, right? And yet so often the application of that knowledge through our patience, through our faith in God is not there. It's not what it ought to be.
Right.
Let's look at verse 12. "Blessed is the man who endures temptation, for when he has been approved, he will receive the crown of life, which the Lord has promised to those who love him. Let no one say when he is tempted, I am tempted by God, for God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he himself tempt anyone. But each one is tempted when he is drawn away by his own desires and enticed. Then, when desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it's fully grown, brings forth death. Do not be deceived, my beloved brethren. Every good gift and every perfect gift is from above, and comes down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow of turning. Of his own will he brought us forth by the word of truth, that we might be a kind of first fruits of his creatures."
Just reading this and talking about the comparison of James and how he directs things, on this point, when you look at Paul in Romans 8, touches on this point too, that God works for the good for people who love him, right? Mm-hmm. And the fact that bad things are not contributed. God does not tempt us with those things, but understanding that good things come from. But God does allow for our hearts to be tempted, right? And that's part of the free will aspect of Christianity that we should be thankful for. Sometimes I'm not thankful for it. Mm-hmm. But the whole point of Christianity is based on that free will and being disciplined and endurance and all those things to where you make the godly decision and not allow sin to come in through the temptation of evil.
Right. And I like how you put that about God allows us to have that temptation, but doesn't push it upon us. I think about it from a parent standpoint. When Addison was learning how to walk up and down steps, I didn't walk up behind her and push her down the steps.
Right.
But I also had to learn to let go of her hand
so
she could experience what it was to fall and to know that when I said, hey, hang on to that handrail or that door, well, then that meant something to her.
Because it's the difference of wisdom and knowledge again, right? Like you can be told and shown, but until you actually apply it and do it, it's not wisdom. It's not going to help you.
Yep. I'm happy to report Addison can successfully navigate stairs now.
There you go.
I don't know what it is about stairs and children, but you talk about it must look like a roller coaster to them.
It's their favorite thing, man.
Yeah, absolutely.
I don't know how we haven't decided just to, build some stairs as a Christmas gift every year, and they'd be satisfied.
Up and down.
That's it.
One last thing I want to note before we wrap up this morning. Look at verse 18. It says, of his own will, of God's own will, he brought us forth by the word of truth, that we might be a kind of first fruits of his creatures. Anytime you see that term, first fruits, in Scripture, it's referring to the choicest first offering of your means, of your harvest, right? You see that terminology a lot in the Old Testament when the Israelites are being given instructions about their sacrifices. And it's interesting that it is in this case by James being applied to us.
Yeah.
That we are the first fruits of his creation. We are the choicest offering of his creation.
Yeah.
And you think about it in those terms, because like it says in 18, of his own free will, or of his own will. God wanted us to be a first fruit, a setting aside of his creation. That we would learn what it is to love him.
Yeah.
That we would rejoice in the gifts that he's given us. That we would praise him for all the great things that he has done for us. And as James started out this letter, and he's talking about all these trials that are to come, he's saying it with the understanding that God still wants us first.
Yeah.
He wants our hearts. He wants our minds. He wants our allegiance to him. And that if we can adopt this endurance, it's been a thread throughout this first chapter, if we can adopt this in our lives and have this ability to be patient through adversity, that God will bring us in as the first fruits of his creation. We'll be the choicest and we'll be rewarded for our efforts.
Right. Definitely.
We're going to stop with verse 18. The next few weeks as we go through James, we'll take it section by section and get into a little bit of the practical application as he sets up so well for us. Here in a few weeks especially, he's going to touch on the tongue a little bit in the end of this next chapter, but we get to chapter 3, it'll coincide great with what Steve is studying with us on Wednesday nights. So we hope that you continue to join us for these lessons. If you know someone who is looking for a Bible class option or maybe doesn't know about us or hasn't been watching us, please share the link, send them a note. We want this to be an opportunity for us all to come together and look at God's Word and find practical ways that we can grow from it.
Right. Those of you who are at 8 o'clock this morning, it was good to see you. Those who come in at 10 o'clock, we'll see you in a little bit. We're excited to see you. Don't forget, we are meeting on Sunday nights at 5 at the building here. Now, tonight is a special night. We're honoring our soon-to-be kindergartners that will start school tomorrow.
Yeah.
So hopefully you guys can be there to celebrate with us and join in that Sunday night lesson. There will be worship and then a little bit of a ceremony after, if I'm right.
Yeah, just a teaser. There's going to be maybe the cutest video you've ever seen, finding out what these young people want to do when they grow up.
Big time. Big thanks to Jake putting together our trivia night last night. If you weren't able to come, you missed out. It's going to be, hopefully, we'll be able to do that again soon, but we'll be looking forward to that. Other than that, we love you guys, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you. Love you.